When the prophet Hosea arrives on the scene in the 7th century BC, the world's in turmoil. The nation of the children of Israel has been divided into two kingdoms for some period of time. You have the kingdom of Judah in the south, made up of two tribes of the children of Israel. You have the kingdom of Israel in the north, made up of 10 of those tribes. The kingdom of Israel has been really idolatrous since its inception. It's repudiated the law of Moses from the very beginning. Jeroboam, the first king, made sure that the people did not go back to Jerusalem to worship Yahweh, to worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But along with internal problems, the empire of Assyria is gaining strength and acquiring a very well-deserved reputation for being very violent and ruthless. In fact, artifacts that have been preserved from that period of time that were made by artisans of the Assyrians actually have forever pictured that ruthlessness. Images of the Assyrians cutting off the hands and feet of the kings they conquer, or sharpening poles and impaling some of their victims on those poles and watching them writhe in pain until they die. Or victorious celebrations where they decorate the gates of the cities of Assyria with the heads of the people that they conquer. If you fall prey to any of those ancient empires, you do not want it to be the empire of Assyria, and yet that's the fate that will befall that northern kingdom of Israel. There's a statement that's made in chapter 4 that really kind of sets the tone for the problems that Hosea enumerates in this book. Chapter 4 and verse 1. Hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel, for the Lord brings a charge against the inhabitants of the land. There is no truth or mercy or knowledge of God in the land. Void of truth, void of mercy, void of knowledge. And that does not mean that it's not attainable. It means they don't care. Now, how do you enumerate that? What do you actually see recorded in the pages of this Old Testament prophet? If you continue in chapter 4, and even in verse 2, by swearing and lying, killing and stealing, and committing adultery, they break all restraint with bloodshed upon bloodshed. It's an unrestrained culture. No mercy, no truth, no knowledge, bloodshed upon bloodshed. Does that seem like something we're beginning to see almost on the daily basis on the nightly news in this country? No restraint, no concern for what is right or wrong, bloodshed upon bloodshed. They break all restraint, an unrestrained culture. The statement that's made in verse number 5 talks really about a kind of an apathetic kind of view. You'll stumble in the day, and the prophet will stumble with you in the night. There's no sure footing by anybody in this culture. And almost a lack of concern. There's an apathy about the way that we address situations. It doesn't really matter. Things are going to happen. We can't stop them. An unrestrained culture, an unconcerned culture, they're stumbling around, and it doesn't seem like they even mind that. And then the very next statement in verse number 6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. And then God says, because you have rejected knowledge, I have rejected you from being a priest for me. You're not going to be an example to the world. You can't even be an example to yourself. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. It's not something that's isolated at that particular point in history. When the Apostle Paul is writing to the Christians in the city of Rome, he makes this comment about Israel of his day, beginning in verse 1. My heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved, for I bear them record that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. Similar pattern. Now, the statement made in Hosea chapter 4 and verse 6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. That doesn't mean that they cannot know. That doesn't mean that the facts are beyond their grasp. That does not mean that they are incapable of differentiating between truth and falsehood, between what is right and what is wrong. They just don't want to know. It takes effort. It takes responsibility. And if I can live in an unrestrained way where I'm not concerned about anybody or anything but myself, who cares about knowledge? Again, does it sound much like situations in which we find the world today? Here's a culture that is unrestrained. Here is a culture that is unconcerned. Here's a culture that is uninformed. They're destroyed because of lack of knowledge. Go from chapter 4 of Hosea to chapter 5, beginning in verse 13. And he talks about the nation of Israel in two different terms, Ephraim and Judah. When Ephraim saw his sickness and Judah his wound, Ephraim went to Assyria. Yet Assyria cannot cure you, nor heal you of your wound. They seem unaware of where the solution to their problem actually lies. They'll look for things that really cannot help. In fact, by seeking assistance from Assyria, thinking that we'll become an ally of Assyria, once Assyria sees the resources you have in your land, you're not going to be able to keep it because they're going to want it for themselves, which is exactly what takes place. So what do you have? You have an unrestrained culture. You have an unconcerned culture, an uninformed culture, and people that seem unaware that the solutions that they have been counting on are not solutions at all. The solutions may be staring them in the face, but they don't want to see them. And there's a statement that's made in chapter 6. Jesus has used it. We talked about some things that Jesus said in Matthew. Here's the statement. Verse 6 of chapter 6. I desire mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. Don't try to appease me with things that are just lip service, without actually changing your behavior, changing your heart, changing your mind, changing your life. Here are individuals that are unfaithful in what they're doing. Now later on in chapter 7, you have a statement made that Ephraim has mixed itself among the nations. Ephraim is a cake unturned. They're half-baked in what they're doing. Half-baked kind of solutions, half-baked kind of actions. And we use that term half-baked, or even in our culture, as a cliche, to something that really is less than it could be. And the statement is made that foreigners have devoured their strength, but they don't know it. Does that kind of sound like today? What's involved in this nation that is destroyed for lack of knowledge? It's more than just being uninformed. It's living with all those things, having that lack of restraint, that lack of concern, that lack of knowledge, being unaware of what's actually happening around them and the solutions they're looking for that really aren't solutions at all. And living in a way that is repulsive, being very unfaithful to principles that should be guiding humanity in the way we deal with one another, and ultimately the way that we approach God. Culture goes through cycles. Unfortunately, the cycle that we see in this culture today is less than positive. And it's not because the answers are not in front of us. They are. Some people just don't want to see them. Let's pray for a change from an unrestrained culture to a culture that recognizes the difference between right and wrong. To individuals that don't care about fact, to individuals who do, to individuals who decry knowledge as being not something that's really all that important to people that see and recognize the necessity of it. Let's pray for an intelligent peace that can come across this land, because right now you don't see much of that. It still exists in those individuals that are not grabbing the headlines with all the violence that they foster against one another. We do not want to be overcome in very violent ways like the nation of Israel, the kingdom of Israel, was conquered by the empire of Assyria. We want to be victorious, not victims. We want to be peacemakers, not just the opposite. We want to help those around us, not hurt those around us. Interesting. 7 centuries BC, a message that still rings out in many ways like it was written today. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.